In the heart of the ancient world, where the rugged mountains of Greece met the endless expanse of the Aegean Sea, a storm was gathering. It was not a storm of wind or rain, but one of ambition, empire, and vengeance. The Persian king, Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, had set his eyes upon Greece, determined to succeed where his father had faltered. For Darius had once sent his armies across the sea, only to be humbled at the plain of Marathon. The memory of that defeat burned in Xerxes' heart, and now he sought not only to conquer, but to erase the very notion of Greek defiance. In the east, from the sun-scorched plains of Asia to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, messengers carried the commands of the great king. Subjects from every corner of the vast Persian Empire were summoned: Babylonians and Egyptians, Phoenicians and Medes, Scythians from the steppes, Indians from beyond the Indus. The empire was a mosaic of peoples, bound together by tribute, fear, and loyalty to the throne of Persepolis. From this vast realm rose the greatest army the world had yet seen, a force so immense that ancient chroniclers spoke of it as numbering in the millions, a tide of men and beasts that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. They marched with splendor and terror alike. Warriors clad in lamella armor, cavalry riding swift horses adorned in glittering harness, war elephants towering like moving fortresses, and ships drawn from every coastline of the empire. At the head of this colossal host strode Xerxes himself, enthroned within a chariot of gold, the embodiment of imperial majesty. His word was law, his will divine, and he had sworn by the gods of Persia that Greece would kneel or be broken. Yet to the west, across the narrow seas, lay a land unlike any other in the known world. Greece was not an empire bound by a single king, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states. Athens, proud and ambitious, championed democracy and naval power. Sparta, austere and unyielding, forged its citizens into warriors from birth. Corinth, Thebes, Plataea, and countless others each guarded their autonomy with jealous zeal. They quarreled and warred among themselves, yet when the shadow of Persia loomed, a fragile unity began to form. For all their rivalries, they understood that if Persia triumphed, their freedom would vanish. Among these city-states, it was Sparta that stood as the iron heart of resistance. The Spartans were a people apart, molded by their laws and traditions into instruments of war. From childhood, Spartan boys were torn from their families, raised in the agog, hardened by hunger, pain, and relentless discipline. Their lives were not their own, but dedicated to the defense of their city and the pursuit of martial excellence. To die in battle was their highest honor, and to retreat their greatest shame. At the head of this warrior society stood their dual kings, and in that year, one name would echo through the ages: Leonidas. It was Leonidas who saw with piercing clarity the peril that now threatened Greece. Though the Persians had numbers beyond imagining, he knew their strength lay also in fear, in the sheer magnitude of their might. If the Greeks were to resist, they needed more than armies. They needed symbols, deeds so bold that they would kindle courage in the hearts of free men. And so, when the Persian host advanced into Greece, Leonidas chose a narrow pass where mountains kissed the sea, a place where numbers would count for little. It was called Thermopylae, the hot gates, where sulphurous springs hissed and steam rose from the earth. Here, between cliff and surf, a few could hold back many. The Council of Greek allies decided to send an advance guard to hold the pass while the rest of Greece prepared. From Sparta went Leonidas with 300 of his best warriors, men chosen not merely for their valor, but for the fact that they had living sons to carry on their names. They were not expected to return. Alongside them marched allies from Thespiae, Thebes, Corinth, and other cities, swelling the number to several thousand. Yet in truth, it was the 300 who would become legend, for their discipline and defiance embodied the spirit of resistance. As they departed, mothers and wives of Sparta gave no weeping farewells, only words that had shaped their people for generations. Return with your shield, or upon it. Leonidas himself, when asked why he led so few, answered simply that he sought to fight not merely with numbers, but with glory. He understood the power of sacrifice, and that some battles were not won on the field, but in the hearts of men and the memory of nations. Thus, as Xerxes' colossal host surged across the Hellespont on bridges of ships lashed together, and as cities fell before the tide of empire, Leonidas and his chosen marched northward to Thermopylae. Dust rose behind them, the creak of armor and the steady rhythm of marching feet echoing against the mountains. They were not many, yet they carried with them the weight of all Greece's hope. And in their silence, in their resolve, there was something greater than fear. There was destiny. The world held its breath, for at the narrow gates of fire and stone, the clash between freedom and empire was about to begin. From the plains of Asia Minor to the rugged valleys of Thessaly, the Persian host moved like a living river, its flow unending, its breadth overwhelming. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath the weight of its advance, and the sky darkened with the sails of a fleet that shadowed the coast. Wherever they passed, villages emptied, fields were trampled, rivers drank deeply of the thirsty thousands who bent their backs in service to the great king. This was no ordinary army, but a tapestry woven from every corner of the empire. There were Persians clad in scaled bronze, their wicker shields painted with the symbols of their houses, their bows strung and their spears tipped with iron. Beside them marched the Medes, their tunics dyed in brilliant colors, warriors descended from horse lords of the steppes. The Sakai came with their pointed caps and battle axes, while the Indians rode elephants draped in crimson cloth, beasts whose trumpeting cries echoed like thunder. From distant Egypt came men armed with long shields and curved swords, their eyes lined with coal against the sun's glare. Each contingent bore its own dress, its own arms, its own banners, but all answered to a single will. At the heart of this sea of humanity strode the immortals, the elite guard of Persia, 10,000 strong. Clad in shining armor, carrying spears tipped with silver, they seemed less like men than like the very essence of power given form. Wherever they moved, a hush followed, for these were the chosen, sworn never to allow their number to diminish. Should one fall, another was ready to take his place, so that their ranks appeared eternal, unbroken, and unyielding. They were the pride of Xerxes' host, the spearhead of the empire's might. And yet, as unstoppable as this multitude appeared, it carried within it the seeds of weakness. The men were drawn from lands as far apart as the Nile and the Oxus, speaking many tongues, bound by tribute rather than brotherhood. Their loyalty was not to each other, but to the gold of Persia and the lash of its commanders. In battle, their strength would be their vastness, their ability to envelop and overwhelm. But if they faltered, if fear spread like fire through dry grass, their sheer numbers could become chaos. Xerxes himself moved at the center of this storm, watching from his chariot as his army stretched farther than his eyes could see. He carried the memory of his father's defeat, the sting of Marathon, where Greek hoplites had shattered Persian ranks against all expectation. He vowed that no such humiliation would touch his reign. He would burn Athens to ash, enslave its people, and grind the pride of Sparta beneath his wheels. His engineers had already shown the scale of his ambition, for at the Hellespont they had lashed ships together to build bridges across the sea, and where mountains blocked his passage, they carved through the rock itself. Nature bent before his will, as if even the gods themselves yielded to his empire. But in Greece, word of this advancing tide brought both terror and resolve. Themistocles of Athens urged the building of a fleet to meet Persia at sea, while Leonidas of Sparta prepared his small force for the stand at Thermopylae. Across the cities of Greece, men whispered of the size of Xerxes' army, some saying it drank rivers dry and stripped entire lands of food in a single march. Yet others believed that courage could still balance the scales, that in narrow places where numbers counted for little, the free man, fighting for his home, might yet overcome the slave of an empire. It was in this spirit that the Greeks chose Thermopylae, the hot gates, as their ground of resistance. Here the mountains pressed so close to the sea that only a few could fight abreast. The boiling springs gave the place its name, a narrow defile shrouded in steam, where cliffs rose sheer, and the waters hissed as though the earth itself awaited battle. To pass here was to walk through a gate of fire, and it was here that Leonidas and his chosen marched, their crimson cloaks billowing like the tongues of flame that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Their march northward was slow but resolute, the clatter of spear and shield echoing through the valleys. At every village they found fear, but also reverence. The sight of Spartan warriors, men hardened by a lifetime of discipline, brought a measure of courage to those who watched them pass. They were few, yet they seemed more than mortal, their very silence a language of defiance. With them marched allies, 700 Thespians, 1,000 from Phocis, men from Corinth, Arcadia, and other cities, together numbering several thousand. It was a slender force against the might of Persia, but it was enough to make a stand, enough to show Greece that the spirit of liberty still burned. When they reached the pass, they set to work fortifying it, repairing an ancient wall of stone that narrowed the approach even further. Each man knew the odds. Each man knew that survival was not expected. Yet still they labored, as though by their hands they carved a memorial that would outlast the empires of men. Leonidas himself walked among them, speaking little, but his presence was enough. He was not merely their king, but their comrade, a man who would bleed beside them, who would share their fate without hesitation. And so, as the dust of Xerxes' advancing host began to darken the horizon, the Spartans and their allies stood ready at the gates. The earth shook with the march of countless feet, the very air filled with the roar of voices, the clatter of arms, and the cries of beasts. Against this tempest, a few thousand Greeks stood, their shields locked, their spears braced, their eyes unflinching. The storm had come, and at Thermopylae, the world was about to witness whether courage could indeed stand against empire. The morning sun rose over the Euboean Gulf, its light striking the waters beside Thermopylae, turning the sea to fire. Mist drifted from the hot springs, mingling with the dust of marching feet, until the narrow pass seemed veiled in smoke as if the gods themselves had descended to watch. The Greeks stood in silence, shields polished, spears steady, their crimson cloaks fluttering like blood against the wind. At their center stood Leonidas, the weight of a king upon his shoulders, but the resolve of a soldier in his eyes. From the Persian camp came the sound of drums, a deep and steady rhythm that matched the beat of 1,000 boots. Trumpets blared, banners lifted, and the tide began to move. Xerxes, enthroned upon a golden seat upon a hill, watched as his vanguard surged forward. He did not yet send his immortals, nor his most seasoned warriors. Instead, he cast forth the Medes and the Scythians, men who had conquered for Persia before, and who now sought to brush aside this token resistance. They advanced in glittering ranks, their wicker shields overlapping, their arrows slung across their backs. They expected a brief struggle, a mere gesture before the Greeks were crushed beneath the weight of numbers. But the pass of Thermopylae was not a plain, and the Greeks were not a rabble. As the Medes charged into the defile, they found themselves pressed together, their numbers meaningless in the narrow ground. The Spartans and their allies stood in a wall of bronze, shields locked so tightly that no man could slip between them. Spears bristled outward like the spines of a great beast, an unbroken hedge of death. The clash came with a roar as wave met rock. Persian arrows darkened the sky, but the bronze shields of the Greeks caught the storm. Spears thrust in perfect unison. and the first ranks of Medes fell, pierced and broken before they could even strike. The Persians pressed harder, driven by the lash of their commanders, but the Spartans rotated their front ranks with precision. Exhausted men stepped back, fresh warriors moved forward, and the line never faltered. Again and again the Persians surged, and again they were hurled back, their bodies piling in the narrow pass until the earth was slick with blood. At times the Spartans feigned retreat, stepping back as if their line was breaking. The Persians shouted in triumph, rushing forward to finish what they thought was victory. But then, with a sudden crash of shields and a cry of war, the Greeks turned as one, driving their spears into the unprepared ranks. The trap closed, and the invaders were slaughtered in droves. What Persia saw as weakness was revealed to be the discipline of men who had trained for this very moment all their lives. The Medes fought with valor, but valor alone could not breach the wall of bronze. Hour after hour the battle raged, the cries of the dying echoing against the cliffs, the sea waves carrying the stench of blood. The sun climbed high, and still the Greeks held, their formations as unyielding as the mountains that hemmed the pass. From his throne, Xerxes watched with growing anger. He had expected his vanguard to sweep the defenders aside, but instead he saw them humbled, their ranks cut down by men who fought not for empire but for freedom. To him, the Greeks seemed mad, throwing themselves into combat with a ferocity that defied reason. He sent more troops, wave after wave, believing that sheer exhaustion must break them. Yet each wave crashed and shattered against the phalanx, as though Thermopylae itself had risen in rebellion against Persia. When the sun began to fall, and the shadows lengthened across the mountains, the order was given for the immortals to advance. These were the finest warriors of Persia, armored in scale, their ranks never diminishing, their discipline unmatched. They moved forward in perfect step, their spears gleaming, their banners proud. A hush fell upon the battlefield, for now the true contest had come. The Spartans waited. Their shields bore the scars of battle, their spears were bloodied, but their eyes did not waver. When the immortals struck, the earth shook with the weight of their advance. The air filled with the clang of bronze against iron, the grunt of men locked in mortal struggle, the cries of those who fell. Yet the pass still held, the phalanx still stood. The immortals pressed forward, but their numbers availed them nothing in the narrow gate. Their spears splintered against the wall of shields, their bodies tumbled into the piles of the fallen. Even they, the pride of Persia, found themselves ground down by the unyielding Greeks. All day the battle raged, until the setting sun cast long shadows across the carnage. At last the horns sounded retreat, and the Persians withdrew, leaving behind a carpet of dead. The Greeks, battered but unbroken, stood amidst the fallen, their cloaks stained, their armor dented, but their spirit blazing brighter than ever. That night the fires of the Persian camp burned low, their mood soured, while in the Greek camp men sang of their deeds. They knew the dawn would bring more blood, more trials, yet their confidence had grown. For they had faced the greatest army in the world and held their ground. In that moment, they were more than men. They were the shield of Greece, the defenders of freedom, and already their story was becoming legend. Dawn broke once more over the cliffs and the narrow sea, and the air was thick with the stench of the dead. The pass of Thermopylae had become a graveyard, its stones slick with blood, its air filled with the buzzing of flies and the groans of the wounded. Yet still the Spartans and their allies stood, shields gleaming in the morning light, spears ready, eyes unflinching. They had endured the first storm, and now they prepared for the next. Xerxes awoke to a sight that defied his pride. He had hurled the Medes, the Scythians, and even his immortals at the wall of bronze, yet the Greeks still barred his way. The losses were heavy, but worse than that was the insult. How could so few men stand against the might of the empire? To the great king, this was not only resistance, it was mockery. His throne was the seat of the world's power, yet a narrow pass and a handful of warriors held him at bay. Fury welled within him, but also unease, for he had begun to glimpse what his father had known at Marathon, that the Greeks fought with a fire that no lash could command. Once again the trumpets blared, and the Persians surged forward. Fresh troops replaced the fallen, their commanders driving them with the whip. They came in greater numbers, their shields overlapping, their spears thrusting, their arrows raining down. But once again, the narrowness of the ground betrayed them. They could not bring their vast host to bear, could not stretch their wings or envelop the defenders. They were funneled into the jaws of the phalanx, where discipline and unity prevailed over numbers. The Spartans fought as one body, every motion practiced through years of training. When one man tired, another took his place. Shields overlapped so tightly that they became a wall of bronze and wood, a barrier that arrows could not pierce. Spears darted out through the gaps, striking with the precision of a serpent's fang. Their enemies fell in heaps, trampled by those behind them, until the pass itself seemed choked with Persian corpses. The Phocians and Thespians stood beside the Spartans, their courage no less fierce though their names would not echo as loudly through history. Side by side, they fought and bled, their ranks thinning, but their resolve unbroken. In the chaos of the melee, Leonidas himself strode among them, his voice calm, his spear deadly, his presence a beacon. He was no distant king commanding from safety. He was at the front, his armor battered, his cloak torn, his beard darkened with sweat and blood. His men saw in him not only a leader, but the very spirit of Sparta, and they fought with the knowledge that their king would never abandon them. The Persians tried again and again, but the result never changed. They were driven back with terrible loss. Arrows fell in clouds, yet the bronze armor of the Greeks turned them aside. Cavalry attempted to force the flanks, but the cliffs and sea denied them room. Even the mighty war elephants, brought from distant India, could not find footing in the narrow ground. Panic seized them, and they turned on their own ranks, trampling men beneath their tusks. For 2 days the pattern repeated. Each morning, Xerxes hurled his men forward. Each day the Greeks stood firm. Each night the Persian camp grew more restless, its fires dimmer, its murmurs louder. Even among so vast an army, the whispers of failure began to spread. How could the great king, master of the world, fail to sweep aside so small a force? And what would it mean for the subject peoples of the empire if word spread that Persia could bleed, that Persia could be held? In the Greek camp, the mood was different. They knew their deaths were likely, but each day of defiance was a victory. Each fallen Persian was a blow struck for freedom. Each hour bought was another moment for Athens to build its fleet, for allies to rally, for Greece to prepare. Around the fires at night, the Spartans sang songs of war, their voices deep and steady, as though they welcomed the end that awaited them. To die at Thermopylae was not despair, but destiny, and in that destiny they found joy. It is said that Xerxes grew so desperate that he offered Leonidas riches, lands, and the kingship of all Greece if he would surrender. Leonidas is said to have replied with scorn, telling the great king that for a Spartan, the only true wealth was honor, and that no bribe could purchase freedom. When Xerxes demanded that the Spartans lay down their arms, Leonidas answered with words that would echo through eternity, "Molon Labe, ye come and take them." Thus the days passed, each one marked by slaughter, each one deepening the legend. The Persians bled in droves, their dead carpeting the pass, their morale waning, and still the Greeks held, a wall of flesh and bronze that refused to yield. But even as the third day dawned, fate was turning, for treachery was about to open a path that no spear could bar. As the third day dawned, the Greeks still stood, unbroken and unbent, their spears bloodied, their shields battered, yet their courage undimmed. The Persian dead lay in heaps, and the air itself was heavy with the smell of decay. Xerxes, enraged and humiliated, paced upon his throne. He had hurled his finest against the pass, and still the gates of fire remained barred to him. His empire stretched across the known world, yet here, at the narrow hot gates, he was made to appear powerless. But where strength and valor failed, treachery would succeed. Among the mountains above Thermopylae lived men of Greece, men whose hearts were not steeled by honor, who saw not destiny but opportunity. One such man was Ephialtes of Melis. His name, whispered in anger for centuries after, became a curse, a synonym for betrayal itself. He knew of a hidden goat path that wound through the high ridges, a trail used by shepherds, perilous but passable. This path, if shown to the Persians, would lead them behind the defenders of the pass, turning the Greeks from unbreakable wall to trapped quarry. Ephialtes came before Xerxes, his eyes gleaming with greed. He cared not for freedom, nor for the brotherhood of Greece. He cared only for reward, for gold, for the favor of the great king. He promised Xerxes what his armies could not achieve by force, a way around the hot gates. To Xerxes, it was as though the gods themselves had delivered victory into his hands. He seized upon the offer, his fury giving way to triumph, and that night he sent his trusted commander Hydarnes with a detachment of the immortals to follow Ephialtes along the hidden trail. By torchlight they ascended the path, the flames flickering against the crags, their shadows crawling over the rocks like specters. The silence of the night was broken only by the crunch of boots and the hiss of the wind through the pines. The path was steep, narrow and treacherous, but Ephialtes led them surely, his treachery guiding every step. Yet not all in Greece were blind to danger. The Phocians, 1,000 men strong, had been stationed upon the heights to guard against such a maneuver. In the darkness, they heard the rustle of movement, the tread of many feet. The morning of the final day broke with a strange stillness. The sea lapped softly against the narrow shore, and the hot springs hissed as they always had, their steam curling into the air as if nothing in the world had changed. Yet for Leonidas and his men, this dawn was unlike any other, for it would be their last. High upon the ridges, the Persians descended the hidden path, their ranks black against the rising sun, and the horns of Xerxes called once more for war. The jaws of fate were closing, and there was no escape. Leonidas assembled the Spartans, Thespians, and the few others who had chosen to remain. He spoke not with sorrow, but with pride. Their sacrifice, he told them, would echo through all of Greece. They were the shield against tyranny, the proof that freedom was worth any price. To die here was not to be defeated, but to achieve immortality. For men would remember their names as long as words were spoken. His words were brief, for Spartans did not gild truth with speeches. Their language was action, and their testament would be written in blood. Then, with shields raised and spears braced, they advanced for the last time. The Persians poured into the pass, their ranks vast and endless, the dust of their march blotting out the sky. But the Spartans did not wait for them to come. Instead, they charged forward with a fury that startled even their foes, crashing into the front lines like a thunderbolt. The bronze phalanx struck with such force that Persian shields splintered and men were hurled back in shock. This was no longer a battle of holding ground. It was a storm of defiance, a whirlwind of steel and rage. The Spartans fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Their spears thrust with precision, their shields slammed into faces and chests, their swords cut down all who dared approach. Beside them, the Thespians fought with equal valor, their cries mingling with those of their comrades as they refused to yield a single step. Again and again the Persians advanced, their sheer numbers pressing forward, but each time they were met with slaughter. Leonidas himself fought in the front ranks, his spear flashing, his sword biting deep, his voice carrying above the chaos. Wherever he struck, The Persians fell back, their courage faltering before the sight of the king who chose death rather than submission. But even the greatest warriors cannot fight forever. Spears shattered, shields cracked, swords dulled with blood. The ground was slick with corpses, and the Greeks were forced back step by step toward the narrowest point of the pass. Their ranks thinned, but their spirit did not. They fought with daggers, with broken spear shafts, even with their bare hands, tearing at their enemies until their own blood mingled with that of their foes. In the midst of the struggle, Leonidas fell. Accounts differ on how he died. Some say an arrow found its mark, others that he was struck down by spears as he fought surrounded. But all agree that he fell fighting, his body surrounded by enemies, his hands still reaching for his weapon. His death was a thunderclap, a moment that shook the very soul of the Greeks. Yet even then his men did not break. Instead they fought with greater fury, desperate to protect his body from the Persians, to deny the great king his prize. The battle raged over his fallen form, Greeks and Persians locked in a struggle not just of arms, but of honor. At last the Spartans seized his body and carried it back, holding it as a sacred relic even as they continued the fight. They would not allow Leonidas to be defiled, for to them he was more than a king. He was the embodiment of their sacrifice, the heart of their defiance. The Persians pressed harder, their arrows filling the sky, their ranks unending. At last the Greeks were driven back to the small hill at the center of the pass, a mound of earth that rose above the carnage. Here they made their final stand. Their shields locked one last time, their weapons raised, their voices rising in a cry that shook the mountains. Around them surged the enemy, countless and merciless. But still they fought, their courage blazing even as death closed in. Arrows rained down in black clouds, blotting out the sun. Spears and swords struck from every side. Yet still the Spartans and Thespians fought on, refusing to kneel, refusing to surrender. They fell one by one, their bodies heaped together until the last of them lay dead upon the hill. The Persians had taken the pass, but their victory was bought with rivers of blood and the knowledge that they had faced men who could not be broken. When the dust settled and the cries faded, Xerxes looked upon the carnage. He had triumphed, yet it was a hollow triumph. For though the Greeks at Thermopylae were slain, their defiance had carved a scar into the heart of his empire. His men had seen that even the mightiest army in the world could be held at bay by courage. That freedom could make men fight as though they were gods. He ordered the body of Leonidas beheaded and crucified, hoping to erase his glory with shame. But instead, he only magnified the legend. For the image of Leonidas, defiant to the end, would echo across generations. When the last Spartan fell upon the hill of Thermopylae and the dust of battle finally settled, silence descended upon the pass. The Persians had won the ground, but they had not broken the spirit that had animated the defenders. The narrow strip of earth was now a graveyard, littered with broken shields, shattered spears, and bodies piled so high that the stench of death would linger for weeks. Yet even amidst the ruin, the story of what had been done there began to take shape. Whispered first among the survivors, and then carried across the seas to every corner of Greece. The Greek allies who had departed when Leonidas dismissed them spread the tale of what they had witnessed. They told of the king who chose death over retreat, of the Spartans and Thespians who had fought until no weapon remained, and of the Persians who, despite their overwhelming numbers, had been delayed for days by a force no larger than a village. To some it seemed like myth, too great to be true, but the truth was greater still. For it was not only courage that defined the last stand at Thermopylae, it was the unyielding belief that freedom was worth dying for, that a man's life was nothing compared to the legacy of honor. In Sparta, the death of Leonidas was met not with wailing, but with pride. The mothers of the fallen spoke the words for which Sparta was famed. He was my son, and he did his duty. The grief was real, but it was hidden beneath the iron mask of discipline. To Spartans, death in battle was the highest honor. And the sacrifice at Thermopylae was not a tragedy but a triumph. They believed their king had fulfilled the prophecy of the oracle, and in his death he had secured the glory of Sparta for generations. For the Persians, the victory at Thermopylae was both a triumph and a humiliation. Xerxes had forced the pass open, but the cost was greater than he had ever expected. His elite troops, the Immortals, had been bloodied by a fraction of their number. His vast army had seen that courage could overcome fear, that skill could hold back sheer weight of numbers. The King of Kings pressed on toward Athens, but shadows now followed him, the whisper that even his might could be resisted. And so the story of Thermopylae spread like wildfire. Across Greece, cities that had wavered now found new courage. Athens, though it would soon be burned, prepared for its naval stand at Salamis. Sparta prepared to march once more. The resolve of a united Greece, fragile before Thermopylae, now grew stronger, bound together by the memory of what had been achieved at the Hot Gates. Years later, when the Persians were driven from Greece, when Plataea and Mycale had broken their power forever, the memory of Thermopylae still burned bright. A monument was raised on the battlefield, a stone lion to honor Leonidas, and an epitaph that would live for eternity was carved into the earth. Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws. Simple words, yet they carried the weight of immortality. They were not written for the dead, for the fallen no longer needed comfort. They were written for the living, to remind them of what it meant to stand unbroken in the face of annihilation. The legend of the 300 grew with the centuries. To the Greeks, it became a symbol of freedom against tyranny, of courage against impossible odds. To the Romans who later conquered Greece, it became a lesson in discipline and valor, studied by generals and soldiers alike. To poets and historians, it became a story to be told and retold, embroidered with myth, yet rooted in truth. And to the world beyond, it became one of the great eternal tales, a beacon shining from the ancient past into every age that followed. Even today, the Hot Gates remain a sacred place. The land has changed, the shoreline pushed back by time, the battlefield covered by centuries of earth. Yet the memory remains unshaken. Travelers still stand where Leonidas and his men once stood, gazing at the mountains and the sea, and they can almost hear the clash of bronze, the cries of defiance, the last roar of men who chose glory over life. And so, the Battle of Thermopylae did not end with death, but with immortality. The Persians took the ground, but the Spartans and their allies claimed eternity. Their story reminds us that courage is not measured by numbers, but by spirit. That even the smallest band of men, if unyielding in their conviction, can shape the destiny of nations. The 300 did not live to see their victory, but in their sacrifice they planted the seed of freedom that would bloom not only in Greece, but across the ages. The Hot Gates became more than a place. They became a symbol, a reminder that when all seems lost, when the tide of darkness seems overwhelming, the courage of a few can light a flame that burns for all eternity. And so the tale of Thermopylae ends not with defeat, but with triumph. For the Spartans, the Thespians, and all who stood there are remembered still, not as men who died, but as men who became immortal.